Alastor Glendon crept across the dark sands towards the cave under the moonless night. This place was so harsh and desolate, so cruel and merciless, that few people lived out in this desert even before day broke. So none of those awful blobs were slithering around here. He knew that a figure of incredible danger was waiting inside that cave, someone who he'd worked tirelessly to reach. He'd either help me or kill me. Time to roll the dice. Alastor had traveled thousands of miles, most on foot, some on a covered boat. What would have been a 15-hour flight from the eastern US to the Middle East back then took him months of hard journeying now, hiding away from the sun during the day and fighting off the attacks of terrible creatures during the night. God, he missed planes. If he could go back, he'd never complain about airline food or the TSA ever again. He didn't know how good he had it. Alastor never learned to fly a plane back in the old world, and when day broke, the planes up in the air tumbled down to Earth. Their pilots turned into nightmarish gelatinous blobs. It was just one of the many luxuries that became absolute death sentences when the world changed, along with sunbathing and long walks across the beach. But Alastor wasn't here to relax. He was here to get the tools that would allow him to take his revenge once and for all, and nobody made better tools than him. As he stepped into the cave mouth, he saw something glint in the distance. If he hadn't reflexively put up a shadow shield in front of him, the obsidian dagger flying at his face would have found its target, and the good doctor would have been killed once more. But he wasn't against some petty dabbler in the martial arts. By the time he'd intercepted the dagger, the fighter was already halfway across the cave. He leaped forward with an obsidian warhammer and shattered the shadow shield, sending Alastor skidding across the sand on his back. He didn't have much time to collect himself, as the man from the cave, better known as SCP-076-2, Abel, leapt into the air and descended like the iron fist of God. Alastor twisted across the sand and escaped in the nick of time once more. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Somehow, in all the danger he'd faced since he came back to life, this was the closest he felt to being returned to non-existence. And Abel would have taken that as a compliment. When the tattooed immortal warrior stood proud, Alastor unleashed a counterattack, a barrage of shadow blades, each of which Abel deflected with a wry smile. Alastor changed tact. He coated his body in a black armor of shadows and rose to fight, putting up his dukes in a boxing stance that he vaguely remembered from Foundation Basic self-defense classes. His opponent seemed impressed by this. You reject weapons and fight with a warrior's heart. Interesting. I'll give you an honorable death. Fist against fist, it was slightly more evenly matched, but not by much. Alastor didn't expect to win, not even for a second, but he'd read enough about Abel from his file to know that he respected someone willing to go to their deaths for the sake of a fight. And he was right. As Alastor lay on the ground, his shadow armor cracked and his mouth and nose bloody, Abel, still in a fighting stance, smiled down on him. You fought well for a wretch. Any dying words, boy? He asked. I heard you could produce weapons greater than any other, Alastor choked out, slowly standing up despite the pain. I need a weapon that could withstand the one that guards gods. This gave Abel pause. Was this man, a mere mortal, planning on facing the Gate Guardian? Yes, he was. Dr. Alastor Glendon had Abel's curiosity. Now, he had Abel's attention. He invited the vengeful scientist back into his cave, where they could discuss the plans that had brought him so terribly far from home. As Abel produced blade after blade from his pocket dimension, melting each one in a grand black furnace that he'd created deep in the cave, he heard Alastor's tale, how he'd been killed by the old man while working for the SCP Foundation, how he'd passed through the gates into the great beyond, and how when day had broken, his own brother, another researcher, had made a deal with the possessive mask to switch their places. So his brother had gotten an express ticket straight to paradise, and he'd been sent into this awful hell on Earth. For one of the few times in his life, Abel felt a genuine sense of empathy. If there was one thing he could relate to in a world full of beings weaker than himself, it was knowing the feeling of being betrayed by your own brother, your own flesh and blood. That was a kind of transgression that simply demanded appropriate vengeance. Over the course of the next day and night in the cave, Abel forged Alastor a mighty blade from many of his own, a blade that could go toe-to-toe with one of the deadliest and most powerful entities ever recorded by the SCP Foundation, the recently deceased Dr. Clef's proposal for SCP-001, the Gate Guardian. When night had fallen again, Alastor accepted the blade with thanks and left the cave. As he was walking away in the direction of the infamous Site-0 at the intersection of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Abel called out to him one more time.
"When you see your brother, do not hesitate to strike him down," he said. "The longer you wait, the heavier your sword will become. That much I promise you, boy."
Alastor nodded and walked on. He still had such a long way to go in all this. As he passed the desert, crossing decimated cities that tore themselves apart in rage and fear as day broke, he felt himself getting hungry and thirsty. He really had gone on so long without food and water, hadn't he? Almost as though the thought occurred to him, he came upon a desert camp where a single elderly man was sitting along with a clay jug full of water, a table, 2 cups, and several sacks of supplies. He also had a free chair, and seemed to show no reservations about a man cloaked in shadow, wielding a huge sword as he approached. Alastor recognized him instantly when he was close enough. It was SCP-343, or as he liked to call himself, God. So, naturally, he was here to preach. God gestured to the empty seat, and without a word, Alastor reluctantly sat. The self-declared deity poured Alastor a cup of water, which he drank, then reached into one of his many bags. God produced a loaf of bread and broke it in half, giving half to Alastor and keeping half to himself. The two ate in silence for a moment, before Alastor spoke.
"And I suppose you're here to talk me out of it?"
"Talk you out of what, my son?"
God asked in a deep, smooth voice. Of course he was going to play it like that. Alastor didn't answer. He knew that his conversation partner was already aware of everything he was thinking, everything he was going to say. It was like trying to argue with Dr. Manhattan.
"I can't make you do or not do anything. That's a consequence of the free will I gave you when you were born,"
God said between mouthfuls of bread.
"But take it from a man who's been around the block a few times, Al. You think vengeance will cleanse you, and perhaps for a moment it will, but what you'll be left with is cold and hollow."
"I read the Old Testament back in Sunday school. You got a taste for vengeance yourself," God shrugged.
"Do as I say, not as I do," he said.
Alastor thanked God for the water and bread, got up, and continued on his quest. He didn't want the reality warper's words of doubt to seep into his mind. He'd come this far. What was the alternative? Just give up and walk the wastes for the rest of his life, while his dastardly brother enjoyed his place in paradise? Just the thought of it made him sick. After several days of wandering, he was nearing his destination, Site-0. He could see the remaining barrier, the giant glowing being, wreathed with wings of fire and carrying a sword of holy flame. The Gate Guardian, the bouncer at the door to paradise, where Alastor's brother was waiting. As Alastor got closer, he felt the immense weight of the Guardian's psychic suggestion bore its way through his skull. Leave. For most, this was enough. Even if they didn't want to, they'd turn around and walk in the other direction, perhaps even forget why they were there. But Alastor had already died once, so perhaps that made him more resilient to its effects. After all, he and the Gate Guardian had already been acquainted.
"I won't leave until I've had my satisfaction,"
Alastor yelled.
"I don't wish to fight you, but if you don't let me pass, it will come to that."
The Gate Guardian stood firm. Alastor didn't want this, but he knew what he must do. He drew upon his every reserve, calling forth all of his shadow strength, every single piece in his body, because there would be no more need for it after this. The shadows enveloped him completely, changing what was underneath. His body grew as layer after layer of cursed shadow was piled on top, the same happening with the sword that Abel had bequeathed him. Soon enough, he was a shadow being on par with the size of the Gate Guardian itself, with his own sword of darkness to match its sword of light. Alastor flew in, taking the offensive, slashing the Guardian with his mighty sword. Its darkness slammed against the light of the being's body, knocking it from its position, but seemingly having no lasting effect. When the Guardian struck back, Alastor felt a searing pain, even through all of those layers of shadow. It was like being struck by lightning, but he couldn't give up. His revenge was riding on this. He swung again, unleashing with his strike a cavalcade of shadow blades and shadow lances. It would have felled an army, but a single counterstrike of the Guardian's blade decimated his attack in less than an instant. It was faster and stronger than he ever could have imagined. He needed to fight harder. The Guardian didn't let up. It seemed to be coming in from every angle, slashing at Alastor with its impossible sword, creating shadowy wounds that would not heal. He tried to strike back, but he found his huge, shadowy form to be too cumbersome in the face of the Gate Guardian's supernatural speed.
Leave!
Its booming voice rang out in his ears again, but it was too late for that now. It was always too late. Alastor roared with impossible, anomalous fury and brought his sword in a brutal side swing against the Guardian's flank, managing to catch it this time. But once again, no lasting impact was made against its body of pure, holy flame. No matter what Alastor threw at it, the Gate Guardian was undeterred. He felt himself reaching the limits of his shadow abilities, pushed beyond the brink. He felt the rage burning within him, but perhaps that was all he had left. The sword Abel had given him was feeling heavier than ever, as his wounds bled shadows that rained down onto the earth below. In a flash, the Gate Guardian appeared in front of him one more time, its sword held far aloft. With one decisive strike, quicker than anyone could parry, it brought down the blade through the shadow monster that had become of Alastor Glendon. He was cleaved apart on an atomic level, leaving nothing in its place save for the flash of dissipating shadow. The Gate Guardian had vanquished another contender. It returned to its position in the heavens once more and bowed its head in solemn prayer. Alastor woke up in the garden some time later. The sun was in his eyes as he lay against that dewy emerald grass. The sun. It had been so long since Alastor had felt it on his skin. So long since it had been something that he didn't treat with hatred or fear. It felt like greeting an old friend that he hadn't seen in a while, and slipping back into all the old rhythms like they'd never ever spent a moment apart. He slowly stood, feeling unusually light on his feet. He looked at his hands. All the scars and calluses he'd collected over his time in the world of the broken day had faded. The shadow he'd so eagerly embraced as part of his body, perhaps even his soul, was gone. The garden around him was so vast and beautiful, it brought tears to his tired eyes. So this is what had been taken from him all this time. Then, a shape crested over one of the grassy hills, a human silhouette against the sun. As the shape got closer, the details came into focus. It was Edward Glendon, Alastor's brother, the man who he'd come all this way to seek retribution against. As his brother approached, his hands started to shake. It was an indescribable mix of emotions he was experiencing. With his head drooping slightly, Edward smiled and said, "Hey Al, it's good to see you." An image started to form in Alastor's mind. It was him, straddling his brother in the grass, his two unscarred, uncalloused hands wrapped around his treacherous throat, squeezing the life out of him. Could a person die in heaven? Or would the torment just go on forever? Could he make his brother suffer, like his brother had done to him? But before this image could become reality, his brother spoke 3 hushed words. "I'm so sorry." Then, a different series of images flooded Alastor's head. It was Edward, if the roles were reversed. He imagined losing his brother to the horrors of the old man's torture, enduring the grief, and then feeling the world collapse around him. If offered that deal by the mask's sweet, intoxicating words, would he have done any different? Would Edward have fought his way to Dr. Gears and SCP-014? Would he have battled the Sarkics and the flesh that hates? Killed the old man? Subdued the possessive mask? Met his demise in a battle with the Gate Guardian and his flaming sword? Could Alastor only say, if the roles were reversed, that he would have been the better man? "What's there to be sorry for?" Alastor said, for the first time in as long as he could remember. "It's a beautiful day out. Let's just go enjoy the sun." Now go check out SCP-001 The Gate Guardian and Insane SCP-001 Fight Gate Guardian vs. Scarlet King for more.